what if people said it's not possible for us to actually understand numbers beyond 100?
Mm,
We anything beyond 100 becomes conceptual. We're not
mm,
actually understanding them in real terms.
that's
I think the
interesting.
same thing is true with people. And so I've done a lot of I've done a lot of research into, you probably know, because I mean this kind of points to the same thing. Poor people actually give considerably more money to charity as a percentage of their
Mm,
income relative to wealthy people, and they're more likely to give that money to charities that directly help people in need. Wealthier folks are more likely to invest in, symphonies and universities,
mhm,
things I care about, but that don't have a direct save this person from dying impact in the same way. Now, I I have poked around and there has been a fair amount of research done that shows that the problem isn't lack of empathy, it's lack of proximity. So when wealthy people actually engage poor people and hear their stories, their giving trends change. Um, and I think the same is true for almost all of these issues. I And, I think I've mentioned I'm a person of faith, and faith communities tend to be a place where you ideally, bump into people who are different from you,
mm.
people who have different life experiences, people where you're like, "Oh, I always assumed everybody with addiction was like this, it turns out," or "I thought everybody who was undocumented was like this, it turns out that's not true." And so, proximity I have found to make a really big difference when we know somebody, they've become human to us, and,
See,
my
that's
experiences getting to know folks actually changes things, which is why you might be right about the lack of hope, because the pandemic has caused us to associate even less with people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds than before the pandemic.
yeah,
And
and
that really limits what we can do in terms of
that
empathy and therefore accountability.
well, but I would even say like proximity. I buy that completely. That's a big piece of it. But I think accountability should supersede that, right? Like I think if you're not holding yourself accountable, then
Yeah.
I could make the argument that proximity is the next best thing because then that almost forces accountability. It's
Yeah.
in your face. It's like it's Uncle Tom's Cabin back in the
Yeah.
day, right? That
Yeah.
forced people to be like,
Yeah.
oh my God, that's happening.
Right.
Well, now we'll do something about it.
Yeah.
Whereas I think accountability in the way you're talking about it is like, don't wait to have to see it and smack you in the face. Don't wait for something to tell you that we can make
Yeah.
this world better and reduce suffering.
Yeah.
Hold yourself accountable and do it anyway,
Yeah.
which I think gets back to your value and where you started in some ways.
Yeah.
Like if we get more people to practice that, maybe then proximity isn't as needed because it's going to be hard to get everybody, in that way. Is that kind of how you think of it with
I think
accountability?
so. I mean, for me, it's interesting as I've had this conversation a lot recently. There's a there's a video going around about this guy who was a pastor and he died. And the first person who spoke at his funeral said, I had cancer and he made sure that when I couldn't work, my family had enough to eat every week. This guy said, when I was in the ravages of addiction, he showed up for me every day to make sure I didn't take another hit. 4 or 5 people are giving testimony to this guy's amazing capacity to show up for people in need. And then this super raggedy kid, well, young adult, comes up and says, he was my dad. He never paid any attention to me.
Mm,
And the whole point of that story was, hey, pastors, charity starts at home. And one of my friends sent it to me to be like, what do you think about this? And I was like, so here's the interesting thing. I think that is absolutely how human nature, like you said, works. It is not how actually any of our religions work.
mm.
Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam all say we are morally obligated to care about everybody as if they are our siblings. Um, and while I honestly think that shows up in all of the major world religions because we're going to prioritize our kids most, and they're just trying to counterbalance.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're like, you should care about everyone exactly the same because that might invite us to care a little bit more than we
Yeah.
normally would.
Yeah, I found that too. I before I started doing this podcast, I was not particularly spiritual or religious.
Hmm.
I still am not practicing
Hmm.
it in any way, shape, or form. But the more that I do this, the more that I open my mind, the more that I recognize and I'm not an expert on it by any means, there's an aspect of all different religions, exactly as you're
Hmm.
saying, which seem to try to be accounting for human nature, right?
Yeah.
Even if you take Christianity, that's what I'm most familiar with.
Yeah.
This whole idea of original sin and that whole idea
Yeah.
of that, like this kind of guilt and shame, which don't get me wrong, like there's aspects of that which have caused a lot of problems
Oh,
and done
yeah.
a lot of horrible things, without a doubt.
Yeah.
But if I try and trace it back to where it first started, maybe I'm being too generous in this, but I think there was an acknowledgement of like, hey, like we're not suited for this. Like we're going to be really
Yeah.
horrible to each other, and we have to acknowledge, be accountable up front, and
Yeah.
say we are broken in some ways.
And we are
We have
trying to
sinned
correct
already.
for it.
Yes,
Mhm.
and we need to
Mhm.
force something. And what better thing to force people to accept this than that
Yeah.
there is a higher power and there's
Yeah.
fear of hell if you don't do it. And like again, it doesn't excuse the horrible things that have
Right.
happened, but there's a very deep like understanding and logic to it if you can understand where that came from.
As well as an all of them also have an invitation to humility because they start out with, "You're not perfect. None of us are perfect, and we're gonna have to acknowledge that in order to move forward." That's the other part of accountability is there's a humility to say, "I don't always get things right,"
Mm,
that I think is it takes a lot of pressure off. It allows me to show up better,
it should.
when I'm like,
It
"Yep,
should.
I screw up sometimes. How did I screw up this time? Because this gives me an opportunity to get it right the next time."
There's a funny thing in that though, where people can take that to the extreme to where
Mhm.
they lose accountability because it's, well, I'm not
Yeah.
perfect. I
Hey,
mess up, right? Like, ah, it happens. That's just me. Like, oh well,
yes.
right? You can go that. So
Yeah, no, it's
that's
totally
what makes this
true.
whole thing so hard.